Morgue and cemetery workers, what is your creepiest experience? I worked in a hospital morgue for 3 years. I was not part of the clinical staff. My job was simply receiving and releasing the bodies. Besides checking toe tags a few times for mortuaries, I generally did not have to see or touch the bodies, as they were already in bags before they came down. However, I have a few stories to share. First, for cultural reasons, a family once wanted to transport their deceased relative themselves. This is allowed if certain steps are taken. The problem was they had nothing to transport the body in. They ended up getting a large box, putting the body in the back of their car, and heading out for a 2-day drive across the Utah and Nevada desert in the middle of summer. I can only imagine how that trip went. Second, an old military veteran passed away, and his large family insisted on walking the body down to the morgue. They played taps, and outside the ancient morgue doors, they performed a flag-folding ceremony. Then, they all stayed while we shuffled the body into a crypt. Shuffling a body into a crypt is not an easy or graceful process. It was incredibly bizarre and uncomfortable trying to do that while they stood there watching and crying. That is what a funeral is for you. Really do not need to see that part. Finally, a new nurse once did not know the protocol for a premature death. She carried the tiny remains down to me in a simple cloth napkin. There are also a few general oddities about hospital life. There is always a season of death when the new residents are getting settled in. The number of deaths jumps noticeably, then calms down until the next year when a new batch comes in. Also, miscarriages and infant deaths are far more common than people realize. It is also quite common for one or both twins to die during or shortly after birth. Cultural note: the season of death mentioned by the narrator is a well-known phenomenon in the medical community, often called the July effect in the United States or the killing season in the United Kingdom. This refers to the period when new medical school graduates begin their residencies. While hospitals maintain strict supervision, statistical studies have shown a measurable increase in medication errors and mortality rates during this transition period in July. This remains one of the most controversial and discussed open secrets within the healthcare infrastructure. Funerals and tombstones are the family business, and my dad has a lot of stories. Here are 2 particularly disturbing ones. My dad and his crew were once called out to a cemetery to clean a mausoleum. Usually, this meant scrubbing off graffiti or fixing something that had broken. However, when they arrived, the groundskeeper brought them over to a tomb where a recently interred body had popped. There was black goop running down the walls and the worst stench of his life. He immediately backed away and called a hazmat crew. Another time, they were dropping a vault, which is the cement box that the casket goes inside, into a gravesite before a funeral. They noticed what looked like large pieces of grilled meat at the bottom of the hole. Upon asking the cemetery director what was going on, since the hole is supposed to be empty, he was told to just ignore it. He did not ignore it. Instead, he brought it up with some others and eventually notified the authorities. It turned out they had a crematorium on site and were only partially burning the bodies as a means of saving money. The leftovers were being dropped into the graves of others who were being buried. Apparently, quite a few people went to jail for that. I work in a rural cemetery in the south of the country. I have been tending this field of the dead for 18 years. I am in charge of maintenance, burial supervision, and occasionally night watch duties when staff is short. That happens often. Budget is always tight, and what most people do not know is that cemeteries attract thieves too. Not vandals, I mean grave robbers. Most think that is something from the past, but the truth is, Some still search for gold teeth, jewelry, watches, anything of value. The cemetery I work at is far from town, with no cameras and rusty fences that should have been replaced years ago. At first, I did not know how to deal with it. Finding disturbed earth, trampled flowers, poorly replaced coffin lids. Once, we opened a grave to bury another family member and found the previous coffin had been pried open. We said nothing. The supervisor told us to cover it and carry on. Over time, you grow numb until you witness it live. It was about 5 years ago. I was making a round at dawn since local dogs had been barking more than usual. I took a flashlight and walked quietly. When I reached the oldest part, the graves from the 1930s, I saw movement. 2 men, their faces covered by ski masks, were kneeling by an open grave. One was digging rapidly, the other was waist-deep inside. They had not seen me. I hid behind a mausoleum and watched. I did not call the police. Sounds cowardly, I know, but I thought, if they are armed, what am I going to do with a flashlight and a rusty radio? I waited. When they finished, they left the coffin lid half on and slipped out through a hole in the wall I did not even know existed. I reported it the next day. No one came. No one ever does. Since then, I have found 4 more disturbed graves with the same signs: carefully shifted soil, scraps of coffin lining left behind, once even a woman's muddy shoe. Sometimes I think they do not even care if we notice any more. But the strangest thing happened last year. A family came for a nighttime wake, something allowed by certain religions, and asked me to watch from the office. Mid-ceremony, an elderly woman came by, visibly shaken, said she wanted to visit her husband's grave buried 2 decades ago. I told her to return in daylight. She insisted so much I gave her directions. Half an hour later she returned, pale, speechless. She left without saying goodbye. Her nephew later told me the grave was empty. When we checked it, sure enough, the coffin was shattered and empty, but the soil had not been disturbed, like no one had touched it in years. People ask if I get scared working here. I say no. I worry more about the living than the dead. But some nights, walking among the gravestones with my old flashlight, I realize not everything missing was taken. Some things just are not where they are supposed to be. I worked in a jail, and the county morgue was attached to it. I would sometimes go help them move corpses around. One night, we were transferring a body into a hearse to be taken to the funeral home. All of our gurneys are from the 1950s or 1960s. They did not really make them to handle a morbidly obese person back then. During the transfer, the gurney broke and dumped a very, very fat corpse on top of the new guy I was trying to show how to do the job. It knocked him over and pinned him underneath, and it took 3 of us to roll the corpse off of him. He was in hysterics and quit immediately, and we all got yelled at for it, even though it was solely due to the fact that we have outdated and worn-out equipment. But yeah, the bodies being brought in are bigger and bigger as years go on, and the equipment for handling corpses usually was only designed for bodies half that size at maximum. We tried to be as respectful as possible while handling the dead, but there is just not a dignified way to move a 500-pound dead person. I have a story about this very thing. We had a female patient who weighed about 550 pounds, which is about 249 kilograms. She had a bowel blockage, and the doctors were trying to get her to lose a little weight so that they could perform surgery on her. Her husband was this small, skinny little guy who kept sneaking food into her room, food like Twinkies, cookies, and other snacks. Our hospital was good-sized, but not huge. I worked nights, and we would have to coordinate with the crew upstairs just so we could turn her over on her side, as it took 10 of us to do so. Sometimes, we had to call our 2 maintenance guys to help if the crew upstairs was busy. She would scream and slap at us and threaten to sue because we wouldn't feed her. Anyhow, she refused to diet at all, and she wound up passing away after about 7 days as a patient up on medical surgical. She was only 34. She left behind a 16-year-old daughter and a grandbaby. Well, the patient was too big to take down to the morgue because she never would have fit through the door, and she never would have fit into one of the individual stainless steel stalls that held our deceased. I worked in the oldest hospital in my city, built in 1863, and the morgue only had a single door at that time, which could not accommodate her size. In fact, when she was admitted, they had to take her down to the warehouse and use the industrial scale to weigh her. Eventually, we decided to leave her in her bed. It was a special bed for heavy people that we called a big boy bed, and pack her in ice until the day shift could handle the removal. I heard that the day shift had to wheel her down to the loading dock in the warehouse and use a forklift to move her into an ambulance that had a heavy-duty frame. That is the one and only time I had to deal with a human being that large. Something similar to the previous stories happened to me. I once had to move a man weighing over 300 pounds from the second floor of a house, with only an out-of-shape 60-year-old to help me, which really meant he just watched me. Our stretcher had wheels that folded up so it could function like a dolly, but I still had to go down a set of stairs with a bend in the middle. The weight distribution was all at the top, so I was trying to wheel this huge man downstairs without dropping him as his weight swung forward and back with every step. I was sweating profusely in my suit and tie, all while trying not to look like I was struggling too hard. I truly wanted this man to have a dignified end, and his wife was right there watching the whole thing. She kept apologizing for him, saying, "Oh, he kept saying he was going to lose weight, but he never did. I am so sorry." It was both sweet and heartbreaking. I thought to myself, sure, this situation is difficult for me, but you just lost your husband. I will be fine. During my last semester of medical school, I interned at a funeral home that also had a contract with the university hospital to receive forensic cases. My shift was the night one, from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., when there was little activity except for the occasional accident or sudden death. The place was cold, but what weighed the most was not the temperature, but the silence. One night, a man of about 50 years old was brought in. He had died of a heart attack while sleeping. His family requested embalming, so he remained in our care. I was in charge of the initial cleaning and the report. When I opened the bag, the first thing I noticed was his strange expression. It was not one of pain or peace. His jaw was slightly tilted, and his eyelids were half closed, as if he were evaluating the room. I knew that sometimes muscles settle like that after death, so I did not think much of it at the moment. While cleaning him, I saw several old scars on his chest and abdomen. One was a jagged 3-inch surgical mark on his upper left torso, and another was a distinct star-shaped scar near his navel. I noted these as protocol. As I went to prepare the preservation instruments, I heard a faint clicking sound, like something small had fallen to the floor. I bent down and found a little metal tag, the kind sewn into high-end clinical clothes. It had a serial number stamped on it. It was not listed in our inventory. I kept the tag to ask about it later, but no one could tell me where it came from. Not the coroner, nor the family when they came to sign the paperwork. 2 nights later, while scanning old digital files, I came across a record of a man with the exact same name from 22 years ago. Same name, but a different date of birth. The cause of death back then was listed as a high-impact traffic accident. The registered cemetery was Jardines del Norte. The coincidence was odd, but then I opened the physical scan of that old autopsy. My blood went cold. The description of the body from 22 years ago listed a jagged 3-inch surgical mark on the upper left torso and a distinct star-shaped scar near the navel. They were identical to the man lying in my morgue today. What was even stranger was the status of that old file. The word "buried" had been crudely crossed out with a digital line, and a new note was typed above it in all capital letters: reassigned, transfer pending. I did not want to ask any questions. I tried to tell myself it was just a clerical mistake or some impossible genealogical coincidence. But since that night, every time I pass the digital archive, I avoid opening old records. It is not out of fear. It is out of caution. Sometimes, the errors are not in the system. Sometimes the system is doing exactly what it was designed to do. Cultural note in Latin America. Public hospitals often collaborate with private funeral homes for handling forensic cases. It's not unusual for students in health sciences to rotate through morgues or autopsy areas as part of their clinical practice. I am not a worker, but I have severe epilepsy. I had a massive seizure while visiting my family's plot once and hit my head hard. My mom had to call an ambulance. At first, they did not believe her when she gave the address, but finally one was sent. When it rolled in, the caretaker came out and hovered around while I was stabilized and loaded, then driven away. Afterwards, while my mom was getting ready to follow it to the hospital, he said, "Well, that's the first time they've ever taken any bodies out of here. It's normally a one-way trip." Then he offered my mom a free plot and burial service if I did not make it. My first internship was in forensic medicine. I was 22 years old, and my assignment included observing autopsy procedures, assisting in sample collection, and filling out basic forms. Nothing could have prepared me for that first week. The body belonged to a man in his 50s. It was apparently a natural death. I was there to watch and learn, equipped with gloves, a gown, and a surgical mask. The smell of formalin, old blood, and refrigeration made me dizzy the moment I entered. Everything was going fine until I had to step forward to log a sample. The doctor asked me to hold the corpse's arm while he worked on the chest cavity. The arm was cold and stiff, but that was not what unsettled me. It was the sound. When I moved the arm, I heard a very faint crackle, almost like twisting dry ice. I froze. They told me it was normal, that gases and muscle tension can still produce sounds even hours later. I nodded and said nothing. Later, I was asked to clean part of the stretcher before the next body arrived. No one else was in the room. Everything was silent, except for the hum of the fridge. That is when I heard it, a kind of whisper. It was not a voice. It was more like a choked gasp, like air escaping from a closed cavity. I thought it was the ventilation system. I stepped closer to check, and the sound stopped. I went back to my task, but seconds later, the same sound returned, longer this time. I decided to step into the hallway. There, I ran into a technician who noticed my expression. "First solo day in the cold room?" he asked, almost smiling. "I heard something strange like an exhale," I replied. "Oh yeah," he said calmly. "Some bodies still have trapped air. It escapes through the trachea or lungs when moved. But it could also be the fridge kicking on." He said it like someone who had heard it 1,000 times. From that moment, I knew this place would not give me horror movie frights, but small, real, physiological jolts that shake you just as you are settling in. Death, after all, has its own sounds. I worked for over 12 years as a forensic technician in a state morgue. I have seen it all: homicides, suicides, and bodies found weeks later. Over time, you become practical, almost clinical. But some cases defy any technical explanation. One early morning we received a young woman, around 30 years old, found dead in her apartment. There were no signs of violence and no substances detected in her blood. The final report read, cardiorespiratory arrest of undetermined cause. It happens sometimes. What caught my attention was her medical record. It was completely clean. No allergies, no illnesses, and no medications. Her employment file said she worked as a librarian in a rural school. She was single, had no children, and no one came to claim the body. I prepared her for the freezer. In such cases, bodies remain in custody until a family member shows up or a social burial is authorized. That night, I handled the intake and the fingerprinting. While cleaning her fingertips, I noticed something odd on her left hand. There was a faint pigmentation on the palm, a circular mark that was not in the original field photos. I noted it down, placed the body in the assigned compartment, and left. The next day I returned for a routine check and, out of habit, ran down the freezer list. Everything was in order except for one thing: the woman's file was gone. So was her body bag. I thought they had authorized the burial, but no one on the day shift knew anything about a transfer. We checked the system. Nothing. We checked the cadaver storage. It was empty. Hours later, we received an email from the judicial system. They claimed the body had been mistakenly delivered to a funeral home and already cremated. Strangely, the funeral home had no prior request and no registered relatives. No address either. Just a handwritten note with her name and the instruction, private service, no family contact. Since then, every time I see a body with no medical history and no next of kin, I check their palms more carefully. I do not know what I am looking for, but I no longer do it for protocol. I worked in a funeral home in college. The weirdest thing I saw was a body that reacted to the embalming fluid. Apparently, the man was jaundiced, so the fluid caused a chemical reaction in his skin. He turned green, but it happened in layers, like rock striations. His feet were a deep Kelly green, and the top of his head was a yellowish lime green. It was as if his body had become a geological formation of different shades. The other thing that freaked me out was a photo album the embalmer kept in his office. It had pictures of strange or unique deaths. One that still haunts me 30 years later was a picture of a man who rode his motorcycle through someone's yard and ran into a metal clothesline. It sliced his head off like a razor at the neck. The picture showed his torso next to his helmet, which still had his head inside it. Cultural note: in the funeral industry, a jaundiced body presents a unique chemical challenge. Jaundice is caused by an excess of bilirubin, a yellow pigment in the blood. When a person with severe jaundice is embalmed, the formaldehyde in the fluid can trigger a rapid oxidation process. This chemical reaction transforms the yellow bilirubin into biliverdin, which is a deep green pigment. If the embalmer does not use specialized jaundice fluids with lower formaldehyde concentrations and specific buffer chemicals, the body can literally change color during the process. This creates the rock striation effect mentioned in the story, layered bands of lime, forest, and Kelly green, effectively turning the deceased into a permanent biological geological formation. I worked as a gravedigger for a family-owned cemetery and mortuary for a few years, about 20 years ago. The craziest thing that ever happened started with a call from my boss at 11 p.m. one night. We were on call during the weekends, so a late-night call was not that weird. But this is where the normalcy ended. He asked me to come down to the cemetery immediately to open a grave that was scheduled for the next morning. He needed it ready by midnight. Then he told me what was happening. Apparently, we had disinterred 2 caskets from a cemetery in the Los Angeles area. This was in the early 2000s, and the bodies had been originally buried in 1979. I do not care what anyone says stainless steel, waterproof caskets are a bad idea. These caskets were intact enough to be removed, but when they were being loaded into the transportation van they bumped together. The corners of the caskets broke, releasing the fluid contents all over the inside of the van. The driver was not happy, but he got on Interstate 5 towards Sacramento anyway for the 6-hour drive. He said he gagged the entire trip. The smell was so overpowering that he had to drive with his head out the window just to breathe. He told the boss the graves had to be open and ready the second he arrived so we could get those caskets in the ground and covered as soon as possible, which we did. The next day, before the mortuary even opened, locals were already calling in to complain about the stench. The fire department stopped by, and the police eventually called to inquire about the reports. The smell was not coming from the grave, it was coming from the van. We stripped out the carpet and burned it. We tore out the plastic and bathed it in bleach, then drenched the inside of that van with every cleaning chemical we had. Nothing helped. Finally, the boss called the insurance company. When the insurance adjuster showed up, the boss met him at his car, all the way across the parking lot from the van. The adjuster immediately asked about the horrible smell. The boss explained that it was coming from the van, and that was why he was there. The adjuster looked at him for about 3 seconds and said, "It is totaled. I will call a tow truck." Then he got back into his car and drove away. Cultural note: the sealed casket syndrome. The use of protective or gasketed caskets became a massive trend in the United States starting in the 1950s. These stainless steel containers were marketed as a way to protect the deceased from water and earth, but they created an unintended biological side effect. By sealing the body in an airtight environment, the natural gases of decomposition have no way to escape. Over time, this builds an immense amount of internal pressure, often referred to by professionals as exploding casket syndrome. This pressure can cause the structural seals to fail violently during a disinterment or even just a simple movement, leading to the exact kind of catastrophic, foul-smelling leaks described in this story.